Let's pause for a moment. Let's come into the present. And let's remind ourselves that we've never been here before. We don't have all the answers. We are right on the edge of the unknown. And so let's enter a space of humility, of curiosity, and of wondering. Let's listen deeply to ourselves and to each other. And let's bring our true selves into this conversation. The essence of who we are. Speaking, listening, on the edge of the unknown.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special program as part of Peace Week 2023. And it's my great honor to be here with two giants in their own respective rights. I'm here with Chief Phil Lane Jr. and with Dr. Karen Malone. Let me tell you a little bit about these extraordinary leaders. Hereditary Chief Phil Lane Jr. is an enrolled member of the Ihanktoa and Chickasaw nations, and is an internationally recognized leader in human, community, and economic development. During the past 50 years, Chief Lane has worked with Indigenous peoples from the Americas, Micronesia, Southeast Asia, China, India, Bhutan, Hawaii, and Africa. He has served 16 years as an associate professor at the Faculty of Education at the University of Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, from 1980 to 1966. In 1982, Chief Lane founded the Four Worlds International Institute, as well Phil is chairman of the Four Directions International and Compassion Gains International. Chief Lane has been the recipient of multiple awards and recognitions. He was the first Indigenous person to win the prestigious WinStar Award, presented annually on behalf of the late John Denver and the WinStar Foundation. In 2000, he received the Year 2000 Award for Freedom and Human Rights given by the Swiss Foundation. In 2008, Chief Lane received the Ally Award presented by the Center for Healing Racism for his dedicated work for more than 19 years as one of the key Indigenous leaders in the resolution of Canada's residential school issue, which involved the sexual, physical, cultural, psychological, and emotional abuse of thousands of Aboriginal children in Canada. Chief Phil Lane has a much longer and extensive bio than that, but we're going to keep it to that for the purpose of these conversations.
Long enough, brother. Way long enough. I know how Karen feels.
Dr. Karen Malone also has a very extensive resume. Let me say, as a professor of education, philosophy, environmental and childhood studies in the School of Social Science, Media, Film and Education, Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. In 2002, she was recognized in Stanford University's top 2% of most cited scientists in the world in subfields education, geography, and social sciences. Professor Malone researches in philosophy of education, science and environmental education, geography, environmental humanities, and childhood studies. As a philosopher, pedagogue, environmental educator, and higher education academic leader, Professor Malone has successfully developed, implemented, and coordinated a number of undergraduate and postgraduate programs. She's done this by establishing cross-disciplinary units, including natural sciences, environmental studies, the creative arts, Indigenous studies, and social sciences. Welcome, Karen, and welcome, Chief Phil. Let me just say our discussion today is around this idea of indigenizing earth knowledges, rising from the ashes. What a beautiful exploration, exploring the possibility of building an alliance between contemporary Western thought and indigenous philosophies, one which acknowledges the history and legacies of colonization and Western knowledge in a way that does not seek to appropriate or co-opt the ancestral philosophy terrain already occupied by Indigenous epistemologies. So that's a big discussion, and we're going to get into it. I'm going to invite Chief Phil to begin us with a little ceremony today.
Okay. Here you go. Here you go, Tushka. Itakiapi, my very beloved relatives of our human family, on this beautiful day, as we move forward, International Peace Week, I just wanted to extend my warm and loving greetings. Say it's a real great honor to be here with such a incredible, good sister and relative who has achieved so much in putting together the understanding of how this universe fits together. So I'd like to provide a short prayer here, put our hearts and minds together. Otakashla Wakantaka, Creator of the universe, most beloved one, all powerful one, most kind one, most compassionate one, ever forgiving one. O ancient of days, O blessed beauty, we give thanksgiving on this beautiful day as we move forward in the fulfillment of the sacred prophecies that not only is world peace possible, it's inevitable. And this is where we're moving. We give thanksgiving to all the relatives, the four directions, east from where comes the red sunrise, the south from where comes the springtime, the west from where comes thunder, lightning, and rain, the north where comes the north winds and Father Sky. And today, most of all, a special prayer and acknowledgement and honor to our beloved Mother Earth, but most of all, her representatives, womankind, who are the foundation, as she is, of life itself. And we just give thanksgiving, and we ask and pray, especially this day, that science and spirituality, the two most potent forces that transform humanity, will become one. Because we know, Creator, you've taught us so clearly, the science without spirituality becomes a Frankenstein. But spirituality without reason, without science, becomes fanaticism. So, Creator, we humble ourselves in that manner again in giving thanksgiving that we've been able to reach across to the everywhere spirit, to the beautiful people, the star people's lands of Australia, as they like to be called, as they know, as we do, they came from Pleiades. We give you thanksgiving in that manner, and we look so forward to receiving this beautiful presentation as we come together as a human family, each of us a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. And our great thanksgiving to Unity Earth, to this beautiful studio we're in, and all those who are working so hard, John Raymer, I could go on. We're working so diligently from the depths of their souls to manifest this new day that shall not be followed by night. Halimi Chante Washte Aho.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chief Phil, for those powerful prayers and intentions as we begin this discussion. Thank you very much. And Professor Karen Malone, you have an opening presentation that will guide our discussions today. So we will throw it to you now, Karen, to take us through your presentation.
And thank you, Phil, for that absolutely beautiful introduction and prayer to our discussions today. It's wonderful to be here. I'm just going to share my screen now, making sure everyone can see it. Oops. Sorry, hang on with the. Okay, let me open it up. And welcome everyone. It's morning here, and I'd just like to thank Ben and Phil for this opportunity to have this discussion today. But before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Barungawan and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the unceded land from where I speak. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'm going to start this presentation with a short provocation, and I'm going to explore these sort of ideas today around the way that we might think about bringing together an alliance between Western thought and Indigenous philosophies through the story of a devastating bushfire that I'm sure many of you may have seen all around the world. And I'm going to talk about how we can, through this discussion, talk about the acknowledges and histories and legacies of colonisation through this discussion of Western contemporary thought. And I'll end the discussion with a question which we're going to share together, and that is really, are we at risk of excluding the ancient philosophical terrain of Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies by claiming Western philosophy has found a new humanities? And I'm going to describe that a little bit more and unpack it in the presentation. Starting in November 2019, for a period of 4 months, Australia was ravished by devastating bushfires. And this image you can see here, this was from my back door looking out across country Victoria in Australia. And this wasn't actually looking at the fires, but this was the intense sky that came across all of Australia. And it really embedded in all of us the fear and the concerns that we had. Due to its intensity, size, duration, and uncontrollable dimension, it was named a megafire. Fueled by record-breaking temperatures, severe droughts, this massive bushfire killed over 3 billion animals, burnt over 26 million acres of country, dozens of humans perished, and buildings were destroyed. Amid the chaos of this destructive black summer fire, there released a whole series of polarizing debates that dominated the media landscape, with many attributing the disaster to climate change. And at the time, the Australian Deputy Prime Minister criticised those who dared to connect this massive fire with climate change and labelled them as raving inner city lunatics and greenies. At the time, the chief executive of the National Bushfire and Natural Hazards Research Centre emphasised an urgency for addressing not only climate change, but the issues of the Anthropocene, and advocated for a shift in our perspective. Fire authorities and farmers acknowledged that their efforts to prepare for the fires because of climate change had rendered their conventional practices of fire control ineffective. Amid this tumultuous period, Indigenous First Nation traditional owners from across the nation called attention to the need to revisit Aboriginal cultural burning practices. They emphasised the importance of acknowledging the changes in land and weather since colonisation, but they offered to share their ancestral fire knowledge with farmers, scientists, and the broader public. And as you can see from this statement by Adrian Brown, a Ngunnawal Māori man who asserted in a public statement, the Australian public should know that the Aboriginal landscape is still here. Our knowledge has been maintained and it hasn't been totally obliterated. This call resonated with many farmers who expressed their desire to incorporate cultural burning into their land management practices. This openness and willingness to embrace Indigenous knowledges has been seen throughout Australia and overseas, not just cultural burning, but also other significant attention being paid by non-Indigenous people to the knowledge and experience of Indigenous people in relation to climate change. But aside and alongside of this interest, there has been an increased trepidation from Indigenous and First Nation people of the dangers of misappropriation, and a lack of deep knowing and relevance associated with practices such as cultural burning due to its connections to a matter of respect, obligation, and responsibility with ancestral lands, waters, skies, and everything in between. So as this public debate continued to shift, not just from the lack of Indigenous ancestral relations, but also a fear that in the rush to embrace Indigenous knowledges, many non-Indigenous Australians fail to recognise the raw wounds surfacing about the impact of colonial histories on Indigenous knowledges and connections to country. This included the historical ongoing violence against many communities who had fought to maintain their connection to ancestral lines and traditions. Incorporating Indigenous knowledge into Western systems without recognising this history, no matter how well-intentioned, always risks a complacency in perpetuating colonial violence. Indigenous feminist scholar Zoe Todd from Simon Fraser University in Canada has underscored the danger of cherry-picking Indigenous knowledge, selectively embracing aspects that appeal to non-Indigenous scholars and scientists and the general public, while all the while sidestepping critical engagement with the political discussions and contexts of the legacies of this colonisation. Fletcher and colleagues who delivered a paper on reframing science in the light of the Indigenous fire knowledge after the mega fires in Australia developed an emerging question which was presented to the scientific community in Australia. Could Western science take seriously the task with which it has been charged and change existing paradigms by seeking an alternative viewpoint and understanding, and not simply seek to confirm its own biases? A viewpoint where we have seen Western scientific views of the Anthropocene, which have tended to, over histories, to denote a universal human who is not Indigenous, has falsely unified the human community and presented a Eurocentric story of Earth's transformation, which does not include the horrors and legacies and stories of colonisation. By exploring the story of cultural burning and other Indigenous knowledges, three commonalities have emerged between what I see as the new humanities or post-human philosophies and Indigenous knowledges, where I believe we can find some alliances that could be nurtured, could be places to begin conversations. And these are ways that we might come to a communion between Western philosophy and academy and Indigenous ways of knowing. So I'm just going to go through each of these very, very simply. The first is this idea of refusing human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism. Conceptually, human exceptionalism and anthropocentric thinking do not support Indigenous and First Nation ways of being in the world, which are situated outside of anthropocentrism. And anthropocentrism, what we're talking about here is human-centered ways of thinking about being in the world. That is, that humans are the masters of the world, are the center of the universe. And all of our understanding of how we come to be in the world is through our human observations, through our human beings. Indigenous philosophies recognize that humans are entwined with the natural world. And if you take something like cultural burning practices, for example, when we think about Indigenous ways of thinking about cultural burning, they don't just go, oh, let's go down and start some burning today. They consider different seasons on the changing country. They think about the movement of animals through the landscape, the subtle weather shifts, the life cycles of plants and wildlife, even down to the intricacies of the time of day the burning takes place, according to sea breezes that might be coming from distant oceans thousands of miles away. What they show is that you need to reveal the entangled and deep knowing of country when you're responding to these fires. You can't just, do it without having that clear connection and understanding. Western thinking, on the other hand, that's based on human exceptionalism, treats Earth and humans as entirely distinct realms. It considers humans as being outside of or above or even exempt sometimes from the ecological considerations of land and country. Posthumanist thought as a driving force in the new humanities has been likened to Indigenous ways of thinking because it seeks to challenge this separation and argues we need to refuse supporting this dividing lines between humans and the rest of the world. Now, this isn't new. Ecofeminists, deep ecologists in Western thinking have thought about this before, for centuries. But this sort of thinking has been marginalised. And I suppose what's important here is that the new humanity has brought these ideas to the academy for the first time in a way that a lot of public debate is starting to come into being. Now, the new humanities through posthumanism describes an unlearning of anthropocentric ways of being and knowing the world, and it demands a disruption of the universal human story. But in seeking to dismantle human exceptionalism and consider beyond the human and see the interdependency between human and non-human, they're seeking to establish a movement called post-anthropocentrism. Now, the problems or concerns or challenges that we have with post-anthropocentrism, that it has often been seen as being in alliance with Indigenous knowledge philosophies. But while there is some congruence between Indigenous approaches and this shift of the new humanities philosophies to a post-anthropocentric philosophy, the difference is Indigenous approaches have never been anthropocentric, so you can't call them post-anthropocentric. In fact, there is no need of unlearning anthropocentrism in Indigenous philosophies. So in fact, the line of thinking from a philosophical perspective is very, very different. The second area that I see that the discussions are moving is the idea of embracing a vitalist ethics of human responsibility towards all life forms. Vitalism as a foundational concept in Indigenous thinking permeates all living beings and fosters an ethical imperative grounded in care, creativity, and reciprocity between living and non-living entities. There is no one way to reflect the diversity, obviously, of global Indigenous and First Nation philosophies, but there seems to be one common aspect that is this vitalist ethics, a care and respect shared across creation and the cosmos. In contrast, Western science has often demonized vitalist life forms. For instance, in the firefighting, it likened the fire as being at war, that we had to go to war with nature, controlling it, managing it, destroying it, contrasting starkly with the Indigenous nations traditions in Australia, where they believe that fire is beautiful, comforting, an entity with its own spirit and energy. And in fact, Carol Peterson, a wise woman from the Noongar Nation, stated, "Fire is a beautiful, warm, comforting entity. It's got a spirit of its own, and we see that and the energy within it, and we respect it." This perspective exemplifies the vitalist ethics deeply rooted in Indigenous philosophies. And so there's a long way to go for Western science to move into this vitalist ethics philosophy. The third and final area where I feel there's some potential space for alliance is the idea of embracing relational ontologies to support ecological interconnectedness. The bushfires in Australia not only claimed human lives, but also devastated wildlife. And across the media, in particular, we saw terrible, devastating impacts on our koalas. Over 60,000 koalas have estimated to perish and have moved koalas to the brink of extinction. The bushfires prompted discussions about relationships, and this was an important shift in our thinking about climate change. So it wasn't just about, carbon emissions. It was also about rising temperatures and drought and logging and farming and backburning and land management. It was about complex issues, especially when you consider a belief system that states everything is connected. So in the desire for non-Indigenous people to adopt Indigenous practices, it is important to acknowledge that the uncomfortable colonial histories or complexities of fire relations in Aboriginal traditions, that we needed to ensure that we didn't repeat the same acts of colonisation by co-opting and embracing relational ontologies without understanding those histories. In a background paper by the traditional owners during the Royal Commission after the bushfires, they stated Indigenous Australians have employed fire for land management for over 60,000 years, but these practices have been disrupted over generations through colonisation. While there was growing recognition of the cultural burning in mitigating the effects of bushfires, traditional owners continued to be concerned about whether those without any cultural connection to land could exercise the necessary care and responsibility. Because understanding cultural burning requires acknowledging as an Australian Aboriginal tradition deeply rooted in ancestral connections. It's a relationship of people and country. That is, cultural burning or cultural land management can't just be added to existing non-Aboriginal practices currently being used by Western land managers. And there was this fear, that many farmers in their desire to want to adopt and bring these practices into their own learning, that they would want them without having to do the work and the labour of understanding Indigenous connections to country. So to build a meaningful alliance between contemporary Western thought and Indigenous philosophy, I believe it's crucial to engage with specific Indigenous ontologies. We need to understand deeply what relational ontologies are and how that fits. And we need to respect the diversity and locality of Indigenous and Aboriginal First Nation people on their place in situ. This alliance must recognise the enormous risks faced by Indigenous people as they coexist within a dominant colonising tradition that has systematically excluded Indigenous knowledge and disrupted their relationships with the land through centuries of violent colonial practices. So when we're asking Indigenous people to bring their knowledges to the Western Academy, we need to understand that that is the legacy and history that we need to address. The new humanities and the post-human philosophy, therefore, needs to navigate this complex terrain with sensitivity and humility, and fully acknowledge the unique contributions of Indigenous knowledges has in responding to the challenges of the Anthropocene, while also realising, as non-Indigenous scholars, we are deeply steeped in the histories of Western Academy. We can't take off that jacket that we are part of that story. Is it possible to build an alliance between contemporary Western thought, philosophies, and Indigenous philosophies, which acknowledges the histories and legacies of colonisation and Western knowledge? Can we do this without appropriating or co-opting the ancestral philosophical terrain already occupied by Indigenous philosophies and epistemologies? And that's the question I leave us with to discuss.
Mhm. Fantastic, Karen. Thank you so much. Are we
Yes.
excluding the ancient philosophical terrain of Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies by claiming Western philosophy is found in new humanities? What a great presentation, Karen. Thank
Beautiful.
you so much for that. And the three areas to explore, of course, are also interconnected, but this exciting idea of an alliance between Indigenous perspectives and philosophies and wisdom traditions and an emerging contemporary Western academic philosophical framework is something, Phil, I think you're very qualified to
Yes.
To receive what Karen is putting forward and to respond with your decades of
Yes.
work of taking Indigenous philosophical wisdom traditions and bringing them to a broader audience. So thank you, Karen. We're really excited to hear Phil's reflections.
Yes. Well, first of all, Dr. Karen, I want to say that I so enjoyed this capacity to put together this integrative scheme of thought. You're what I call an integrative generalist. That is somebody that has great knowledge about a whole number of things and can put them together. And that's what I see reflected in your thinking. Not only is the coming together of Indigenous science and Western science, or Western science and spirituality or wisdom, whatever you want to call it, is not only possible, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. And I believe that this goes way, 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 way down deep in terms of this need to share with one another. Because our elders tell us and explain to us the concept of the prior unity and oneness of our human family and all life. And the hurt of one is the hurt of all. And the healing, the upliftment, the honor is a healing, upliftment, honor of all. That we are intimately related. That from the very beginning that has no beginning, we've always been who we are, human beings, related intimately to one another. Now, with that foundation, I'd like to bring us to between Christmas and New Year's 1982. We were at a very, very, very tough time. Intergenerational trauma from incredible abuse in residential schools. So many things. And many of our communities were suffering 100% alcoholism. But of course, I won't get into that part, but prophecies had been fulfilled just at that time. And so we called together through a new initiative of the federal government, the Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Program. We called together a meeting of elders. 40 elders came together from tribes that had never met before, never. And they consulted for 4 days and 4 nights. And at that point, we just had a mainframe. And I even put it in there so all the elders would have a chance to have a small group meetings. I didn't really understand much about it, other than we'd been prophesied about the coming of the everywhere spirit of the internet. And after we were done, we did our best to summarize, to distill what these elders had said. In essence, what they said. This universe we live in is organized according to certain natural laws. These physical and spiritual laws are intimately connected, intimately. They said the physical laws are easy to understand, and this is what I see Western science exploring. They want to explore the seen world, the world you can see. And so we know, for instance, if I jump off a 100-foot building and on my head, I'm going to get a headache. That's just a natural law. If I drink a glass of arsenic, I'm going to get a big stomach ache. If I drive a car 100 miles an hour into a concrete wall, I'm going to get smashed up. That's just the way it is. So there's certain physical laws that we see Western science. And then, of course, now they're coming into whole new dimensions of quantum physics, et cetera, as this understanding expands. But at the same time, the elder said, there's natural spiritual laws that are just as real, in fact, at the very foundation of the physical laws. Because if you violate these spiritual laws, you end up exactly having what we see in the world today that you so perfectly explained, but sadly, you might say in our hearts, because we're having the same kind of burning in terms of fires here. And by the way, we used as well cultural burning, very well established and large fun. In fact, this was a huge garden when our relatives from inevitably came here. The world's round, we're naturally curious, and we're all here. So anyway, so I would say this, that I see Western science as the exploration of the seen world, and we can begin seeing with the work of Einstein and Tesla and others and so forth, where they're saying that the next step forward will be in frequency, the understanding of that, and what happens. What's that space before the thought? What's that place before the world of names? That's what I believe what indigenous sciences look at. And that's the unseen world. Those forces that govern this physical world and govern us so we can live in harmony and peace with one another, which, we can have all the science we want. At the same time, if we're destroying one another, as is happening right now, and using the science to blow each other up, to kill each other, to spy on one another, to do all these things, we're violating the sacred gifts that's been given to us, which is to uplift our human family, which is to further our understanding of our gifts of our mind and our soul, to uplift the arts, which is the way, for us, the last part, and well, get your thoughts here. But, really, it's so interesting. The elders tell us that the symbol system by which we can mediate our experience with this physical world of time and space are mathematics in all their forms. I mean, literally, mathematics. And that's where really the foundation of Western science is primarily a mathematically based system. And they measure things through mathematics, which really is limited to them to the physical world of time and space. Now, we know as well that another symbol system by which we mediate our experience between us as human beings is spoken and unspoken language. But then how do we mediate our experience with the unknown worlds? The arts, the songs, the ceremonies, the art, all those things. I mean, why is it that somebody pays $2 million for some painting somebody did 500 years ago? There's something about that touches your soul. When you go to these ceremonies, you hear the singing. Our still relatives in Australia, you hear that song, and that's what they're concerned about. Do the people who are going to use this understand what dream time is? Have they been in dream time? Do they know what dream time is? Because you've got to be aligned when you do something with the environment. Have to be aligned. And so, the coming together, and I would use the word religion in science, but it's been so abused. Because if you actually go to the Latin foundation of the word religion, it means to bind together, to bring together, to unify. That's why I say, to me, that's why I call them guiding principles, are that same thing that can well, that's what I see science is trying to work for a unified understanding of this world we live in, right? And we base next step in science based on what other people have done before. But we also need the same thing, I believe, in the spiritual way. That for instance, I can use a hammer, like people are getting all this about AI. I can use a hammer to build a beautiful home or to kill somebody. Last thing, I do want to add this. I think we have to get down, because I know one of your gifts is the childhood, early childhood, children.
Mm.
This is one of the greatest gifts Indigenous people have to have, is how do we raise our children, how to be a good grandfather and how to be a good parent, or grandparent, or grandmother. I mean, it's key how we treat the child in the womb, the practices we have, what happens as a child's born. I mean, the idea of having that child embraced without cutting that umbilical cord right away is something that was just natural, a natural thing. I mean, so we know that epigenetic process, especially in those early years, is so key. And so what's happening? My gosh, the greatest epidemic we have here in the United States and Canada is fentanyl deaths, overdoses among certain populations. Can you imagine? You know, and from my perspective, no consumption, no cartels. We need to look inside here. And that's what the elders are calling for. And I believe that's what you are so brilliantly reflecting to all of us. So I could go on because you inspire me.
Okay.
But I wanted to say that much.
Yeah.
And
so, well, a couple of things I'll quickly, and maybe Ben also wants to chip in. But when you talk about Indigenous, you know, talking about natural laws of being in the world. And I think the interesting thing is, in science, we call that laws of nature. And I think that shift, natural laws, is that it tells us that the world brings all of those, as you say, pluriverses into play, how we come to understand.
Exactly.
Law, natural law is the way that the earth and our connection to the earth and the planet and the cosmos frame our living. When you turn around and say laws of nature, it objectifies nature as having something that we then go and, you know, try and understand through truths and facts, as if it exists, as you said, as an entity, as an object of our consideration. I want to think also about what does it mean to be in the world and what it means to know the world. And in philosophy, we talk about ontology as what it means to be in the world, and epistemology as what it means, you know, to know the world. And in the new humanities, and I think this is, again, a space that we can think about with our alliance with Indigenous knowledges, they talk about onto-epistemology. That is, you cannot be in the world without knowing it, and you cannot know the world without being it. And so disconnecting the being and the knowing somehow in science has, again, created this, you know, sort of divide. I'd also like to think about you know, when you talked about children, that I'd like to share with you a story that I think will really be uplifting. When I talked in the paper about refusing human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism, which is a Western cultural nuance of what we teach and what children learn through the practices of becoming human in the societies that we've created. So to be human is to become anthropocentric. I've been doing research with children pre-language, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous children. And we're working on this idea of how do we understand sensorial ecological knowing, the body knowing its being in the world, and observing how children pre-language experience and share their knowledge of being in the world through their bodies. And what that's being able to let us see is that something I've always believed, and you would believe absolutely, Phil, that children, all children of the world, are born non-anthropocentric. They are not, they come from the womb seeing themselves as part of an interconnected cosmos. That is how our bodies are born. What Western society and culture does is it inculturates a way of being human that is disconnecting. As slowly as children grow in our schools and in our childhood, early childhood, is that we teach them this objective way of seeing the world in a very one view of living, which is, as you said, is the physical universe. It's about living in the everyday, in the here and now, in what I can see and feel around me. What that takes away, of course, is the cosmos and the spiritual universe that they slowly lose connection with as we teach them to become. To me, what we need to do is nurture that cosmos and spiritual language and knowing that children have from an early age, but also work with children to unlearn some of those practices and allow those other areas, to be supported. So, and I think, and this is where I have some hope, is because even though there are these challenges with these new humanities and these philosophies, it is through these philosophies that people are asking these questions in Western Academy for the first time. So they're not just saying Indigenous knowledges are something outside of us and, can we take that because, as Zoe Todd says, let's cherry pick of that because that sounds really neat and we might get a few Indigenous people to do some research with us. And, and so it's a very token academic scholarship. But actually trying to disrupt the current way that we think about the humanities, to embrace what it is that we've lost and understand the loss and understand that Indigenous and First Nations people still have those. And we should be, have the humility and reverence to acknowledge that and be asking how we can learn, deeply and return back to those, philosophies that were ours, but we have neglected, and we have put aside in Western Academy.
One of the relatives I really suggest, and we can help you connect to her, I want you to meet, is my Toja, Dr. Lila June Johnston. Her dissertation she's just completed, by far, is the most enlightened understanding of the Indigenous perspective in terms of what we're discussing I've ever seen. I mean, it's brilliant. It's beyond brilliant. And I think that I really believe that has the capacity to really help advance this inevitable coming together of science and spirituality, or Indigenous science, Western science, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we could have discussed about every sentence that you've shared. I mean, you really have a tremendous mind. But what I want to do is kind of, if I can, put this together in maybe a different way. The White Buffalo Calf woman came to the Ocheti Shikoan, the 70 Sacred Council fires, we figure about 950 AD. And the vibration of her words, her teachings are in all our songs. And she is still to this day honored and that's a foundation of our Sundance, of so many things. She is. She is. And the foundation song, as best I know, that she gave us, it says this. Kolale Cheli Wayonkie. 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 Chanupa Kile. Wakayelo. Wayonkie. Now, these words say, behold, calling upon all those in the unseen world, our creator, our relatives who are close in our closest vein to behold this. It's usually when we're with a sacred pipe, preparing that sacred pipe. And then the words say, the pipe, the chanupa, is the holy of holies. That this sacred pipe, that here is a holy of holies. So what is it really saying? It's saying the mineral people, that make up the foundation of life. They're sacred. They have the power of cohesion or unity at the foundation of all things. Without that unity, nothing else can be. And from it emerges the plant relatives, the plant people, of the power of growth, and are one with the mineral people. And then, of course, now, by the way, that's the bowl of the pipe. Woman, foundation of all. That earth, Mother Earth. The stem are the plant people, power of cohesion and growth now. Cohesion and growth have manifested in this ontological process. And then, of course, with all our bundles like this, we have even the deer hide here, the animal relatives, the power of the senses, the power of the senses. And now, not only the power of the senses, but because certain animals, tympanium, their ear is very sensitive, for instance, example, to the pressure changes. Before a storm ever comes, we know they're coming. Because that bird will move a certain way, a horse will move a certain way. So we know that the senses of the animal relatives are more developed than ours. That's why we studied and watched them so carefully, because they told us everything. We could tell if people were coming, going, whatever. And also when they came about in this cycle of life, would tell us when to plant. So we're all, this was just one. So that's why you would never take more than you needed, because these were weak and relatives. And then, of course, we come to when you have the bowl. Now, this is womankind, the foundation of all. The stem, of course, represents the male dimension of this thing. So when you put them together in a sacred way, it's the coming together of life itself, human beings. But who are we? We're one with the mineral people. That makes the very foundation of our life, the very foundation. And that's why we have to respect water, especially. Water is life. And then we have the plant people, the power of growth. And we begin seeing the symbiotic relationship we have with the plant people. They breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. And so many other things, as we know. In your studies, we can see it's just amazing how incredibly synergistic and how incredibly related intimately everything is. Everything in this incredible world we live in of time and space. But then, of course, we then come to our human beings. Plant, animals, humans. We have the human part. There's also, by the way, a connection. But there's also that connection to the worlds beyond time and space. And that's our soul. And the last thing I would say is, and our soul, which we believe is manifested upon conception, is a sovereignty ancient, imperishable, everlasting, and that this soul it has no gender, has no class, no ethnicity, no race, because it's a reflection of the oneness of this entire creator, what do you want to call it? Because we call it something sacred, moving, because it's beyond the world of names. We can't describe it. So I just want to respond as best I could to the feeling I got, the sense that I got of all the things, see if I could tie them together a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That is such an honor to hear. And I'm so grateful for your openness, and this is what my heart sings when I hear the possibilities of us not seeing ourselves as separate and divided, but respecting and honoring the knowledges that Indigenous people have, but also understanding, that we are all born of the earth. We are all coming from the same cosmos. So we need to have these conversations. We need to break down these barriers in a way that is respectful and has reverence and brings, you know, honesty and openness to these conversations. And my fear is that we need to be really careful with Western Academy because it has such a history of taking and not giving and not having that openness,
absolutely.
taking and wanting for the things that it needs and often for things that are very harmful for, you know, animals and plants and other humans. And so we need to do it cautiously, but we need to do it with an open heart. And I think there are a lot of new scholars coming forward who believe that this is the conversations they need to have. And I'm hoping that some of my work and others who I know in the Western Academy that want to honor your views and your ideas, that we can have those conversations. So thank you deeply for your contribution.
And by the way, sister, and this is the man who's doing it. He's the man that's bridging these gaps, Mr. Ben Bowler in United Earth.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phil.
I mean, really, no.
Phil.
I mean, you sat here while I'm going on and on and on, very patient.
Loving it.
But really, thank you. I mean, this is what it takes.
I think it's amazing, and just really, I think there's something very special here in terms of, Karen, again, congratulations on your paper. I think it's really
beautiful.
tipping the point of the spear of a whole wave of evolutionary direction that we're moving in. And we have so many more questions, and maybe this is just part one of an ongoing dialogue. You mentioned, Karen, about the appropriation and the domination and the taking without giving as a dynamic that's been so prevalent in Western thought and philosophy. So how, as we have a new wave of people that Karen is representing here in academia, in culture, in the arts, that are looking back to Indigenous wisdom and saying, we've lost something that Indigenous people still have, you know, and what are the principles for people who are reaching out to engage Indigenous communities, who want to engage Indigenous wisdom, Phil, in an authentic way? Perhaps before we finish today, just give us, from your perspective, some of the principles for anyone out there who may have that inclination to want to learn. What are some of the things that you would say as we
well, this is my personal perspective. I know some of my relatives may have different perspectives, of course, always. But way back in late 1969, one of our great elders shared, he said, we must share what we have. Because if we don't share, Mother Earth's going to die and we're all going to die. From my perspective, if we really, my father always taught me, he says, go back to the logical conclusion of this. Okay. So, first of all, this opportunity, this incredible process going on right now would not be here without Western science, this capacity to communicate. Now, if we really get back to the thing, and this is how I feel it, certainly all these things need to be really greatly respected. But if you go, for instance, those countries that haven't been colonized, like Thailand, they want to share their spirituality. I think that we have a lot of fear here after the genocide that occurred. And I think it's time to share. I think it's time. And by the way, if I really went to the logical conclusion of this, that means I only keep my cultural part. That means, oh my gosh, this was made out of a sewing machine. Oh my gosh, this, I can't use that. I can't drive a car. I can't use my cell phone. Let's realize that every part of our human family have gifts to give together, and it's time to let go of this hurt because we can see where it's taken us. Now, that's my perspective. And at the same time, I honor and respect those relatives who don't feel the same way, that they want to keep things. But what I've found, when you do this, you die, because it goes like this. But you have to open up your heart and mind and come together and share these incredibly beautiful, because it enhances us as human beings. It doesn't drag us down. At the same time, like you said, it is true, that very true. Our incredible medicines, plant medicines, have been taken and abused and used. And many things of our indigenous, 80% of all the food being eaten on Mother Earth today was domesticated in the Americas. People don't realize that. 80% of the food, every bit. So I just say that's why the spiritual dimension of growth and development is so important, because this is where I think where we have to all really come together and be mature. But I'm for sharing. I'm for sharing. And I am, as far as I'm concerned, every human being on this Mother Earth has the right to pray when, where, how they choose. Whether it's right here, sitting here with you in Australia, or it's all by myself, or I don't want to pray with anybody else. That's everybody's choice. But it's time to open our hearts and minds to this incredible time we're living in. That's what I say, brother.
Dare I say, aho.
Oh, you sure may say aho.
So thank you so much, Phil. And it hasn't been easy being in that bridge between worlds. And, having talked a little bit about Phil's journey, it's not an easy one to be
it's not.
an ambassador from one world to another, or even to inhabit multiple worlds at the same time. But that's not an easy thing to be doing. But Karen, again, thank you for stimulating this amazing conversation. Let this be part one of an ongoing dialogue with practitioners, including Chief Phil and others around the world as we continue this idea, this beautiful idea and this timely idea of building an alliance. And that, that is something that takes effort, takes commitment, takes listening, deep listening, and also takes courage. So I want to thank you, Karen, for your courage and helping bring us forward. And of course, thank you, Chief Phil, for live
enjoyed it
with us.
very much.
Us all. And maybe Karen, final.
And thank you.
Well,
thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Karen, is there anything you want to say to close up?
Just to say, look, thank you. And, of all the things that I would wish at this time is that we do have that opening, that, that we have some deep listening. We have a chance where people stop talking sometimes, too much noise, and just actually spend time together and understand that this is an amazing world that we share, and there is still remnants of beauty and glory and spirituality that exists, and we just need to stop and listen and ask people like you, Phil, and others to show us the way. We need to be taken by the hand and let's do this together. So I'm so very honored, and thank you, Ben, and thank you, Phil, for inviting me today. It's been an absolutely stimulating and wonderful conversation. Best wishes. Cheers.